Good afternoon, students. In the previous class, we have discussed optimal choice of consumer. So, when we know when in the market, if we have a bundles, I'll say this: price of the commodity is given. It is P, and income of the consumer is also given. It is M, and we have the goods. We can say X1, X2. When we have a good a set of bundle and we know the price and income of the consumer, what consumer has to do? So he will do he will go for optimal choice. The optimal choice means keeping all these things in mind, knowing the price of the commodity and what are the commodities available and what is his income. When all these things are given, consumer will select those goods which gives him maximum satisfaction. When we select that bundle, we call it as optimal choice of a consumer. So he will select according to his taste and preferences. So when price is given, income is known, and what are the goods we know as per his taste and preferences, and what is the price, what is his income. According to that, he will try to select the good which gives him maximum satisfaction. That called as optimal choice. So when these are the indifference curves which gives him same satisfaction level, and being this as a budget line, which line the line says that the cost of the bundle is equal to the income of the consumer. So when this budget line tangent to this indifference curve, the point, the location where we get this point, this is the bundle X1 star, X2 star. This is the bundle which contains these two products, gives them maximum satisfaction. We call it as optimal choice. So when we know this, today, knowing all these things, today we are going to discuss one more topic that we call it as demand. What do you mean by demand? And what is demand curve? What is law of demand says? So today's topic is demand. And further, we are going to discuss demand curve and law of demand. So I'll write here what do you mean by demand. This demand we discussed in the previous class as well. Demand means what? It is the willingness of the consumer to buy products and also his ability to buy these commodities. So we should have these things: his willingness as well as ability to buy the product. If we have these two things, then we call it as there is a demand for that commodity. Correct? So now how we can put that in word? Demand is the willingness and the ability to buy. I'll mention that here. The quantity of a commodity, the quantity of a commodity that a consumer is willing to buy and is able to afford. when the prices of the good and consumers' taste and preferences are given. So, how can we define this demand? As I said, it is the quantity of commodity that a consumer is willing to buy and is able to offer that commodity given the price of the goods and consumers' tastes and preferences. It means that what is the quantity the consumer wants to buy, what is his willingness, and ability. When he has a willingness and ability to buy the product, and what is the commodity he will buy, that we call it as demand. When the price of the good, price of these goods and taste and preferences and income are given. As I said, price is given, income is given, taste and preferences of the consumer is given. Then when all these things are given, what is his willingness and ability? So I can say when price of the commodity is given, when we know the income of the consumer, and when his tastes and preferences are given, what is the commodity he want to buy, his willingness and his ability to buy those goods, we will call it as demand. Demand of that particular commodity. Correct? This is, in simple terms, it is his willingness and ability to buy the goods when price, taste and preference, income are given. It means that these things are fixed here. So we are not changing anything here. These are fixed. These we know. When we know all these things and they are not variable things, when this is the situation, what is the willingness and ability to buy that particular commodity? We call it as demand for that commodity. So this is, we call it as demand. And what do you mean by demand curve? When we know demand, how this demand behaves, so that gives us demand curve. If we represent the demand function, it will give us the demand curve. So we know demand, now we need to understand what is demand curve. So demand curve is a graphical representation of demand function. We call it as demand curve. The graphical representation of demand function is called demand curve. So what do you mean by demand curve? We know demand. If this demand function we represent graphically, then the graphical representation we call it as demand curve. Suppose this is demand curve. So it says the demand function. If the demand function, if we represent in graphical way, the curve what we get, we call it as demand curve. To understand in detail about demand curve, first we need to understand what do you mean by demand function. Correct? To understand demand curve, we need to understand first what do you mean by demand function. So when we know demand function, if that demand function, if we try to graphically represent what the curve we get, we will call it as demand curve. So now in demand curve, we will try to understand what do you mean by demand function. What do you mean by demand function? Suppose there are two variables. What are those two variables? One is price and another one is quantity. These are the two variables, and this demand function says that the relationship between these two variables gives us the demand function. Correct? So when we say two variables are there, price and quantity, suppose there are two goods in the market, X1 and X2. So to buy these goods, there are so many things which decides which bundle he has to select or which commodity, how much quantity he has to go for. There are so many things which has a influence on this buying decision. So as we know, to buy this, the one influential factor is his income, correct? His income, the price of the good, as we discussed, taste and preferences of the consumer. If his income changes, then the set of bundles changes. That also we discussed in the previous class, changes in the bundle set. Bundle set, we call it as budget set. The set of bundles, we call it as budget set. So, how it's going to change? When there is change in the income. And what is the change if the prices also changes? If income changes, what is the change in the bundles that consumer prefers to buy? If price of the good changes, then what is his preferences? So these things influence on his buying decision. Also, his taste and preferences. What is his taste and preference? Based on these things, his buying decision depends. Now, when we are discussing two variables, price and quantity, we'll keep other things fixed. Means we'll assume that there is no change in other things. There is no change in his income. There is no change in his taste and preferences. So these are already given. Correct? When these things are given, how this function works. So we will put that in word. What do you mean by demand function and how to understand this by mentioning these two variables. So demand function we can define it as the relation between the consumer's optimal choice of the quantity of the good and its price. It's called demand function. So what do you mean by demand function? Here, the relationship between the consumer's optimal choice of a quantity of a good, as we know, he wants to select the quantity optimally. His choice is always optimum. He wants to go for optimum bundle. That we call it as optimal choice, correct? So the quantity, the optimal choice of quantity of a good, particular good, and its price. So what is the relationship between the goods he optimally selected? What is the quantity and what is its price? The relationship between these two we call it as demand function. So we will try to understand with an example here. Suppose we have two variables, as I said. I'll use this space for example. Two variables. X is a variable and y is one more variable. So here we'll take an example. The x values are given here 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and y value also given. I'll take the same example here 10, 15, 18, and 20. So we have two variables x and y. The values of x is given here, it is 0, 1, 2, 3, and the values of y variable it is given, it is 10, 15, 18, 20. Now, how we can write this demand function? Demand function is y function is equal to the function of x. Y is equal to function of f. What do you mean by that? For example, if x variable, if you take the value 2, the function of x is equal to y. So when the x value is 2, then we will get the y value as 18. So what is the relationship here? This relationship between x variable and y variable, if we represent that in function, we call it as demand function. It means that if x is 2, then the y is 18. There is a relationship between x and y that we are mentioning in this way. Function of x is equal to y. So here we need to understand what is x and what is y. X is independent variable. This we call it as independent variable, and this is dependent variable. So we will understand that what do you mean by x and y. This we will put as demand function. Demand function says that y is equal to f of x. As I said, x is independent variable and y is dependent variable. So here I will use this table x, y. The value of x variable, I'll take it as 0, 1, 2, 3, and the values here I'll take it as 10, 15, 18, and 20. Now I'll take one more set here where I'll change the values here. I'll take 0, 5, 10, and 20. And the respective y values are 100 here, 90, 70, and 40. If you see these two tables, when there is increase in this variable, there is a increase in y variable as well. Correct? When there is an increase in the x variable, there is an increase in the y variable. If you see this, when there is an increase in the x variable, the y variable is not increasing here. It is not increasing here, but it is decreasing. So that is the change here. When the value of x is increasing, the y value is it is not decreasing here, it is increasing. In this example, when x values are increasing, the y value is not increasing, but it is decreasing here. If this is a scenario, then what we call it for these two behaviors. As we know, x is independent variable. Why we call it as independent variable and why we call it y as dependent variable, we will come to know that. So I will try to put this graphically. Here the x-axis have taken x variable and the same y-axis have taken y variable. The same with this graph. Here the x values I have mentioned from the second table 0, 5, 10, 15, 20 and we need still 100. So what I will mention 25, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. And here 5, 10, 15, 20. At 0, it is 10. When x variable is 0, the the value of y variable is 10. When x is 1, 15, 2, 18, 3, 20. 1 is 15, 2 is 18, 3 is 20. And I will put these numbers also here. 0, when 0 it is 100, when it is 5, 90, when it is 10, it is 70, 10 is 70 here, when it is 20, 40. For 20, we have 40. So I will mention the values here for the points. It is 0, 10, it is 150, and it is 280, 320. And the values here 0, 100, 5, 90, and the third one is 10, 70, and the fourth one is 20, 40. First, I will draw these graphs, then I will explain what do you mean by this independent variable y. Here the y value is increasing, why the y value is decreasing here, and what we call for this. All those things we will discuss once I draw this graph. This is 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. If you join these lines where I have 0, 10, 115, 218, and 320. I'll get these points, and here it is 0, 100, 590, 10, 70, and it is 20, 40. If you join these lines, we'll get an upward slope here. If we join the points here, we will get a downward slope. So we have an upward slope here, and here we have a downward slope. So what we call for upward slope, and what we call for downward slope. So that I mentioned here. The upward slope we'll call it as the increasing function, and the downward slope we'll call it as decreasing function. So here, when I say the function, how we call it as y is equal to f of x. This is the demand function as we discussed. So here y is the dependent variable and x is independent variable. So what do you mean by x here? It is, as I said, we have two variables. Two variables. One is price, right, and second one is quantity. So here the x is price and y is quantity. When we know the price and what is the demand. The demand is dependent on the price of the good. So that is why there is a relationship between price and the quantity. This relationship we call it as demand function. So here the whatever we have taken x, it is price of the good and y is the quantity of the good. Suppose here in this table we will put this in this demand function. So this, hope you can see here, I can write this function of x value 0 is equal to 10, function of 1 is equal to 15, function of 2 is equal to 18, and function of 3 is equal to 20. So here, when there is an increase in the price, there is increase in the quantity as well. If this is how the function, the demand function or the demand curve behaves, the demand for that particular commodity, if it behaves like this, when there is increase in the price, there is increase in the quantity, then we call it as increasing function. Increasing function. If there is an increase in the price, for increasing function, we will mention in algebraic form y is equal to 5 plus x. How we arrive into this equation, that is not covered in your syllabus, so we don't need to worry about how we got this equation. Just remember that it is increasing function. Y, if we try to put this in algebraic form, then it will look like this: y is equal to 5 plus x. So as it is increasing function, we can mention this line as y is equal to 5 plus x here. And for this we will call it as increasing function. And if as the price of the commodity increases, the quantity is, the demand is reducing, then that we call it as decreasing function. And the algebraic equation we will mention in this way: y is equal to 50 minus x. For increasing function, this is the algebraic representation. For increasing function, y is equal to 5 plus x. For decreasing function, it is y equal to 50 minus x. So now y is equal to 50 minus x. Don't worry too much about how we receive this because it's not covered here. Just we will go here with the equations what is given. So demand function behaves both the ways. The demand curve, sometimes when there is an increase in the price, there will be an increase in the demand. When there is increase in the price, there will be less demand for that product. So we can see these two behaviors in the market. So that will be represented here. So why we call x is independent variable? Because in the function, demand function equation, that is f of x is equal to y, there is no change. The x value here is independent here. So whatever the values given here, we will put that f of 0, f of 1, f of 2, f of 3. This is independent. It is not dependent on anything. That is why we call it as independent. And why we call it as dependent variable? Because based on x values, the y value is dependent on x value. The result what we received here, the y value, it is dependent on x value. That is why y is always dependent on x. That's why we call this y as dependent variable and x as independent variable. So as we know, x here it is price and y here is quantity. So the price is always independent variable and quantity of the commodity it is dependent on the price of the product. The quantity is always dependent on the price of the product and the price of the product is independent variable here. And as I said, if we mention that in the graphic algebraic way, we get this equation y is equal to 5 plus x for increasing function. And what do you mean by increasing function? When there is a increase in the price, the demand or quantity for that commodity also increases. It will not reduce, but it increases. If this is the case, then we call it as increasing function. When there is an increase in the price of the commodity, there is decrease in the demand. There is a decrease in the quantity of the commodity. This we call it as decreasing function. So now I'll put this in word. What do you mean by increasing, decreasing function? In the function y is equal to f of x if y does not decrease with increase in the value of x. In this demand function, if y value does not decrease with the increase in the value of x. So y value here, if you see y, these are y values. The y values does not decrease, they are not decreasing here. They are increasing 10 to 15, 15 to 80, 80 to 20. Does not increase, instead they will, does not decrease, instead they will increase here with increase in the value of the x. With increase in the value of the x, the value of the y, it does not decrease, but there is an increase in the values here of the y variable. So from 0 to, if the x value is from 0 to 1, it increases 1 to 2, 2 to 3, then the value of y, it is not decreasing here, it doesn't decrease, but it will increase here from 10 to 15, 15 to 80, 18 to 20. If this is the case, then we will call it as increasing function. And in algebraic form, we will mention as y is equal to 5 plus x. This is algebraic representation. for increasing function. Now, what do you mean by decreasing function? The value of y does not, this is does not, the value of y does not increase with increase in the value of x. In a decreasing function, the value of y does not increase with increase in the value of x. So for that, we have taken this example. This is increasing function and this is decreasing function. If you see, the increasing function says that the y value does not decrease with increase in the value of x. This is y value and this is x value. Y value does not decrease with increase in the value of y. With the increase in the value of x, the y value does not decrease, but it increases. This we call it as increasing function, and in algebraic form we will represent in this way: y is equal to 5 plus x. And in decreasing function, it says that the value of y does not increase with the increase in the value of x. Here, the y value, it does not increase with the increase in the value of x. So if you see, the value of x, it is increasing, but the value of y, it is not increasing here, but it is decreasing from 100 to 90, 90 to 70, 70 to 40. That's why with the increase in the value of x, the y value does not increase but decrease here. If this is the case, then we call it a decreasing function, and we will represent in this way: y is equal to 50 minus x. So when I say this, what we understood here is, what do you mean by demand? And demand function is the relationship between the y and x variables, and as we know, x is price and y is quantity. So that demand function equation we will mention in this way: y is equal to function of x, and x is a independent variable, and we will take that in the horizontal axis. The value of x, which is this, remember, here what we are doing, as you know, this is independent variable and we have taken that in x axis. So independent variable we are taking in x axis, and dependent variable we are taking in y axis. The independent variable is price here, and the dependent variable is quantity here. Correct? So this is the we have taken by putting down data into graphical way. But in economics, this is in the opposite case. Here, instead of taking this independent variable, as I said, understand it carefully. In general, we will take the independent variable price in x-axis, horizontal axis, that is x-axis, and the dependent variable quantity we will take in the y-axis. But in economics, this is in opposite way. The price values we will take in the y-axis. The price values comes in y-axis, and the quantity comes in x-axis. If you see the demand curve, if you see the demand curve here, in the y-axis we are taking price, and in the x-axis we are taking quantity. So it is exactly opposite to what we have done here. Here we have taken one price here, independent variable price, and in the y-axis we have taken dependent variable quantity. Correct? But in demand curve, in economics, we will take the price instead of x-axis. We will take the price, value of price, in y-axis, and value of the quantity we will consider it x-axis. We will do exactly opposite to this in economics. So it means that when there is increase in the price, the quantity is less. When there is a decrease in the price, the quantity increases. When there is a decrease, the quantity increases. If it still decreases, the quantity still increases, like that. So that's what demand curve says. That is, in economics, we will take in a reverse order. The y-axis is price and x-axis is quantity. Here we have taken the price in the x-axis and the quantity in y-axis. That change you need to understand. Don't get confused with these changes when we discuss the demand curve. So that's why I am explaining again. Here it is price in x-axis and quantity in y-axis. When we are discussing the demand curve, the quantity comes in x-axis and price comes in y-axis. That's how we will represent these values. So, as we know, a demand function is relationship between these two values, x and y, and x is price and y being the quantity. If we try to find out the relationship between price and quantity in functional way, that we call it as demand function. And price is always independent variable and quantity is dependent on the price of the good. If we represent that by x and y, x is independent and y is dependent. If with the increase in the price, if the value of the y, that quantity does not increase, I'll leave this. If y does not decrease with increase in the value of x, it means that if price increases, then price increase होने से क्या होता है? Quantity reduces, right? But that is not the case here. When price increases, there is no reduction in the quantity here. It is not reducing. There is an increase in the quantity. So if that is the case, we will call it as increasing function. With the increase in the price, the value of x, if there is no decrease, with increase in the value of x, if there is no increase in the value of y, it means there is no increase in the value of y. It is decreasing here in this case. Increase in the value of x, there is no increase in the value of y, but the value of y is decreasing here. In this case, we will call it as decreasing function, and we will represent in this way. So that is it for the day. We understood what is demand and what is demand function, and in demand curve, we need to understand this demand function. So we understood how this increasing function behaves, and we also understood how this decreasing function behaves. So in the next class, we will discuss about the demand curve and law of the demand. This is it for the day. Thank you. Have a good day.